Hello friends, this is David Sami with A Christian Journey. I want to welcome you to our Tuesday night Bible study. And today the subject that we want to put on the table is, can man find fulfillment apart from God? And we are now in the book of Genesis chapter 3, and we basically want to look at the narrative of the fall. What happened to Adam and Eve? And we want to look at it in three parts. The first part would be, why did they fall? What happened? Next week, we want to look at some of Satan's strategy. How did he cause them to fall? How does he work? And a week after next, the third week, we want to look at the result of the fall. What were the consequences of the fall? So we are in Genesis chapter 3, and we pick up where the serpent begin to have a conversation with Eve. Now this serpent was an instrument of a higher being, namely Satan. The word Satan actually means adversary, to oppose, an opponent. So here we see a being who is opposed to God beginning to speak to Eve through the serpent, using serpent as a tool. And it's interesting when we see the narrative, and he begins by asking a question. Has God prohibited you from any of the trees in the garden? Now this is an interesting question. It's almost like, has God prohibited anything here? Is he saying that there is something that you shouldn't do? And the woman begins by saying that we may eat of the fruit of the trees, but God said that we should not eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And here, if I may do a narrative that would kind of try to bring out more in a fuller way, maybe the full meaning of the discussion that Satan had with Eve, maybe add thoughts that would complement and make the picture more clear about what was Satan mentioning, his motive, his kind of accusations of God, to bring these to light. Satan would goes something like this, maybe, that, is that what God said? You won't die. He knows the fruit of this tree will open your eyes. It will open your mental and spiritual faculties. This would elevate you to become godlike. You would have the ability to observe a situation and know what is good and what is bad for you. Really, you won't need God anymore. Maybe he doesn't have your best interest at heart. Maybe this is why, of all the trees in the garden, he has prohibited you from this one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A tree that would be beneficial for you and give you the ability to know what's good and bad. Maybe he wants you to depend on him. He doesn't want you to be free from him to decide for yourself. He wants you under his own thumb, if I may put it that way. The temptation here is freedom from God as a result of elevation of human capacity. Unfortunately, the woman becomes the judge. She evaluates the situation herself and decides for herself, who is right here? Is it God or is it the serpent? Unfortunately, the way she considered this question was solely on the basis of her observation. She put her self-interest above loyalty to God. But you know, every one of us, we stand where Eve stood. And the question is this: do we live our lives on the basis of our own knowledge, our own observation, or how things appear to us, our desires? Or do we live on the basis of what God has said? Every one of us has to make that determination, because how we answer this question, it would take us in two different roads. That these two roads represents two ways of living that at times they may be contrary to one another, but the destination of these roads would definitely be different. And this is the question that we want to put on the table. Would we find fulfillment apart from God and His ways? Can we live lives independent of God? And when it's all said and done, at the latter part of our lives, to look back and to think, I lived a well fulfilled and meaningful life, that things worked out and all is well, and now I truly am satisfied with how things turned out. Now, the first question though that we need to ask yourself is this: did God commit anything wrong by commanding them not to eat? Does God have the right to prohibit us, and in their case, prohibiting them to eat of the fruit that He said you shouldn't eat? You see, as their Creator, He has the right to give them command. He has committed no evil. We human beings, we live our life on the basis of autonomy from God. We live as if there is no God, that we just happen to come on the scene and there is no God. And how dare does He put any demand on us? But in reality, as our Creator, He has the right to put any demand that He wants. And He has committed no evil, because He is our Maker. He was Adam and Eve Maker, and as such, He could have the right to put demand on their life and to do it justly. But can man live a right kind of life only by his own observation? You know, in our society today, we are living at the height of disbelief, that we decide for ourselves what is good and what is bad. We even sometimes want God to ultimately give us what we think is good for us. You see, we don't want a God that would put any demand on us or tell us what we should do. We like a God who is like a grandfather, who would just basically sitting on a sideline, and we can call Him when we need Him, and His goal in life is to make our lives happy. But you see, this is a fictional God. If God submitted to our will and always gave us what we want, He would not be God, He would be a servant. We would be the God. We would be the one that He is conforming to, and not us conforming to Him. You see, we even unfortunately see this even in some of our Christian circles. In many Christian circles, God has become a means to an end. And the end is our success. We hear sometimes preachers talk on TV or in radio, receive your miracle. Today is your day to receive a miracle. Today is your day for blessing. We are conforming God to the likes of our culture, to what we think the people in our culture desire. We are making God to fit in that mold, in that picture. He is here to serve us, to bless us. And even some ministers who would void what God has said in order to not offend people, who would plainly disregard what God says because maybe they want to be loving, or they feel like this is how God would be like, and they disregard clearly what God has said. You see, these type of ministers are not really representing Christ, but unfortunately they are representative of Satan, somebody who opposes what God has said. And we need to be careful about this. If you listen to people who are always focusing you on what you can get from God, there is a problem. But the people who want to point you to God and have you conform to Him and His ways, His desires, they are pointing us in the right direction. For God was not made for me. I was made for God. And even in our own personal life, I'm almost 60 years old, and I always have been an observer of life, observer of values that are permeating in people's life, in society, and how things turn out. And after all of these years, I can honestly sit here before you and honestly say the people that have tried to do things God's way, now they were not always successful, or they were not always wholehearted, but there was something in their life that always made things to turn out okay for them. That there was God who was watching over them, whether they realized it or not. And even though these people went through difficulties, at the end, things worked out for them. But in the process, they came to know God to a certain extent. They began to truly fall in love with God, not because what He can do for them, but because who He is. And we were made to enjoy Him. But on the other hand, I have seen people who appeared very successful, especially in the early on in their lives, in the beginning of their lives. And they always did things their way. They relied on their own geniuses and their own abilities and how they would be able to navigate through life just fine, just by themselves. And unfortunately, it seems like as years went by, their success turned a little bit upside down. That even though there were areas that they did find success, they lost in the areas that mattered the most. You see, our problem primarily lies in the fact that we have our own self-interest above everything else. And we don't want to conform to God. And because we don't want to conform to God, we don't want it to be a God. I don't want it to be a being that imposes His will on me. So I find a way to make Him not to be there, or disbelieve Him, or pretend that He doesn't exist. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, it is not because He doesn't exist, but my problem is I don't want Him to impose anything on me. And many things that God says that we shouldn't do. As a matter of fact, morality is protective, not restrictive. I mean, we stand back and our heart goes out to people who are in bad situation, who are struggling with many things that unfortunately was the result of their own choices. But you see, we don't take any pleasure of saying, How can we prevent these things from happening? We don't think that maybe some of these things could be prevented if we would do things God's way. But because it appears restrictive, it appears that it infringes on my freedom and what I want to do, I deny God and His ways, but only to harm myself, only to find out later on in life that no, I was not right, God was right. When God says I shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't have. And He does not have all of these commands that He makes a man to fix it. But He makes these commands for the benefit of mankind, that it may go well with us. So I am convinced that we cannot live apart from God and His ways, a life that would be fulfilling and meaningful, even in our societies. Our main problem is departure from God and His way, and right and wrong. And that's why I think we don't have answers for the decline of our social values, for the decline of our societies as a whole, because we have pushed God out of the arena. He no longer, we don't value what He has to say about issues and subjects of life. So as a result, we're just left to ourselves. And I am again convinced, after many years of studying, watching people, watching situations, watching how things turn out for people, that man was not made to live apart from God. We think we do fine, but in reality we don't. And unfortunately, we are at the threshold of making man to become God, to become immortal, with AI, technology, and some of the things that may be on the horizon that are coming our way, that would maybe offer us even immortality, but at the expense of losing our humanity, to be made in the image of God, that we would forfeit that for immorality or other things that are coming and they're on the horizon. But when it's all said and done, I think we were not meant to be living fulfilled life apart from God, because we were made to bear the image of God and to be like Him. So just some thoughts on this question. And now next time, Lord willing, next Tuesday, we want to look at some of Satan's tactics. How does he tempt us? What are the tactics that he employs? And we kind of try to examine some of his ways and some of the ways that he would kind of attack us and to make us part ways from God's ways and from Him. So until next week, may the Lord be with you. May He watch over you. May He make His face to shine upon you. This is David Sami with A Christian Journey. Lord be with you.